All right, y'all. Welcome to the Helicopter Podcasts. I'm your guy, Halsey Schider, and I am so excited to have Christine Brown on the Helicopter Podcast today. This is going to be a really fascinating conversation and a journey in her career as a helicopter pilot. It's pretty awesome, and I'm super excited to talk to her about that. Before we get too far into it, though, special thanks to Vertical Helicast for making the Helicopter Podcast possible. And of course, we couldn't do it without our wonderful sponsors, both Bell Helicopter and Celicopter. So thank you to all involved. And of course, to our listeners, near and dear to my heart. Love you guys. Really appreciate all the positive feedback and the fact that you guys are listening. So we're going to keep doing this, producing great content. And I can't do it without super awesome guests like we have today with Christine. So if you want to be a guest on the show, or you know someone that's super badass that wants to be on the show, please hit us up on social media. So Christine, welcome to the Helicopter Podcast. How are you?
I'm good, Halsey. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining. We've been messaging a lot of people on Instagram. That's kind of the cool thing of our world that we live in now. Like, love it or hate it, social media has completely changed the landscape. And it's so fun to go and kind of peruse these different social media profiles of these pilots that are doing really cool things. And Christine, your profile caught our eye with kind of all the fun, amazing flying that you're doing. So I appreciate you joining. I know that we kind of cold called you per se on Instagram. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story.
Yeah, no problem. I agree with the social media thing, and I think it's really fun to be able to like see everybody's stories and just share stuff that you wouldn't normally be able to share with. Just reach out, to all the different aviation enthusiasts out there.
Yeah, totally. It's really, social media has taken on a whole new thing. People, it's just like, just sharing kind of what you do in your life and finding out, hey, that's actually super interesting. And other people kind of want to live vicariously through your experience. And so I think it's a really cool medium. When you and I were growing up, it was like our medium was television and movies. We couldn't connect with anyone that wasn't, say, in Hollywood or an actor or something. And now we get to connect with people that may have a really big following, but at the end of the day, they're just normal people doing their day-to-day thing. And so it's been really fun for me to connect with a lot of people through Instagram with the Helicopter Podcast, because there's just a lot of badass guys and gals out there doing cool things. And you're certainly one of them. So before we kind of dive into what you're doing now, being, flying for Columbia Helicopters, which is near and dear to my heart because I grew up in Oregon. And one of the reasons I kind of got into helicopters was we used to go to a pumpkin patch, go figure, Halloween being yesterday. There's a pumpkin patch right out there in Aurora that you have to drive right past the Columbia ramp to get to. And I remember being like a little guy looking out the car and being like, what is that? Like, that is a giant helicopter. Like, that looks so amazing. And so I think it really actually kind of enhanced my yearning to be in helicopter aviation. So super cool. I can't wait to talk about Columbia, but just kind of start from the beginning. What got you into helicopters? Where did you do your training? And see where it takes us.
Yeah, totally. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, and then I moved to California when I was in high school. I had a few family members that were pilots, but nobody like directly that I knew. It was always pretty fascinating to me, but I didn't really realize it was an option. I thought you had to go through the military to become a pilot. So that was my understanding of it. Anyway, I went to college in California, Cal Poly, I got my engineering degree, and I was a civil engineer for a few years for Chevron, oil and gas. But during my college experience, my mom took me to Africa and we went on safari. And during my safari in Africa, she actually took me on a helicopter tour. I think it was in like a 206 or something. We
Nice.
went over, yeah, we went over Victoria Falls. It was probably like 10 minutes, you know, it's probably just like we just did a little loop, but I remember being just so fascinated. And the pilot was like maybe 22 or something. It was probably one of his first jobs. Now that I think back on it, but I just remember being like, "This is so awesome! Like, I can't, you know, I would love to do this." And this guy's doing it, and he's, you know, almost the same age as me. So I went back to Cal Poly, and I was like, "Well, I have to finish my degree." Obviously, I was almost done, and I decided to get my fixed wing, and that was 2000 and probably 12, 2011, I think. So I went to the local flight school because I couldn't afford helicopter school. But back then, the fixed wing rating, the private rating, I think it cost me like maybe $4,000. You know,
That's
like it was so
crazy.
cheap. It was so cheap, but comparatively, not for a college student. But so I worked my summers washing airplanes for the flight school. I went to flight school and got my private and sort of just left it there. Um, and then I realized, you know, helicopters are way more fun. I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but on my solo cross country flight, my first one in this 152, I think it was to like somewhere near Bakersfield, if you're familiar with California. So way out in the valley, it was just really boring, and I almost fell asleep. And you know, and it should be like really exciting, right? You're like
I know.
flying, it's your first time, you're going somewhere, and I was like, oh my gosh, I should probably, you know, look into helicopters. So I took a discovery flight um, at San Luis Obispo Airport, and I just loved it. I thought it was so fun, but obviously I didn't have, what is it, 100 grand to get my license. So I went to work for Chevron for probably, I think, 3 or 4 years. Chevron Oil and Gas is an awesome company. They paid super well, and I got a lot of great experience with them. But after 3 or 4 years, I had saved up a pretty good amount of money, and I just said, "I'm leaving. I'm going to flight school." My mom's not wasn't very happy with that
I
decision.
was gonna say I could see a lot of people in the peripheral being like, "What the hell are you doing?"
Yeah, she's like, "No, what are you doing?" And you know, she's the one that took me on the flight in the first place, so
It's her fault.
it's her fault. No, it's not her fault. But my parents, you know, they're very supportive, and so I quit Chevron, dumped all my money into flight school, got my ratings in about 10 months because I was just going every day and I didn't have a job, and my money was just dwindling, right? And I went to flight school in Utah. It's called Mountain Ridge Helicopters. I think they were absorbed by Utah State
Okay.
University recently. So they still operate, but under the USU. It might be UVU, so don't quote me on that. Um, so yeah, got all my ratings there. They didn't have a slot for me as a flight instructor, so I just sent out resumes all over the US essentially for cherry drying, for flight instructing. And I actually got a position in New Jersey at a now completely defunct flight school. Won't get into it, but packed up my truck. I had a little Nissan truck that barely worked. Drove my stuff across the US and did flight instruction probably for like a year and a half. Got 1,000 hours, and then I started flying tours with Liberty helicopters.
Okay.
Great operator. I think they're now also defunct. I think they might be operate under a different name.
Yeah, I think you're right. I had a conversation with someone recently about that, and yeah, I don't think it's under Liberty anymore, but different name. I actually kind of funny two stories on what you're saying. I was in a 152 cross country flight from Aurora, ironically enough, to Salem, feeling extremely bored. And I remember hearing a helicopter on the radio, and I literally thought to myself, I bet you that guy is having more fun than I am. And so it's funny to hear that you kind of had that similar experience because I like this is God, this is probably nearly 18 plus years ago, but it's still like I remember where I was. I remember I was 3,000 feet. I mean, like it was just such a clear memory for me. So it's interesting for you to say that. And I agree. I mean, at the end of the day, helicopters, it's really a machine that like you're putting on as an extension of your body, whereas an airplane, they kind of want to fly, they're happy to fly. They're aerodynamically stable. Whereas, a helicopter, we're trying to kind of force it to fly. And in doing so, it's kind of almost like a third leg. So I definitely think that's, kind of super cool. And then actually, I got all of, similar to you in making kind of like a decision that others might find kind of hard to believe is I was working at Hillsboro, had a pretty good job working with Dan, our mutual friend, Dan Dopeker at the time. Shout out to Danimal. Um, that's what, I don't know if that's still his nickname, but that's what we called him. So maybe you can start that at Columbia,
I
Danimal.
like it.
Um, and I ended up following a girlfriend of mine down to Texas and kind of left a pretty decent career at Hillsboro and didn't have any helicopter job prospects lined up in Texas. And I was parking cars for a while. And there's a lot of peripheral, like, hey, what is he doing? And that path ended up working me into so many other paths into helicopters. And it's been tremendous. And it's the best decision I ever made. And that girlfriend is now my wife. So that's also a plus. It worked out. But, I think it's really cool to make that leap, we get one life to live and we're going to constantly be faced with decisions. And I think it's really neat that you took this pragmatic approach to it where it's like, okay, I dig flying. I think it's really cool. I did this flight in Africa, which would probably be epic. But you kind of thought about it. You figured out how you could get to that goal and you did it. And so I think that that's really neat. And I'm sure leaving Chevron was probably kind of a big leap of faith. But it's always really fun to hear people taking that leap of faith. And now here you are as a command pilot, at Columbia. Obviously it's worked. So it's just kind of cool to hear. And I appreciate you sharing that. And for our listeners out there, if you're on the edge right now of trying to figure out if you should do this crazy career or not, follow your gut and, have a plan. It's not always going to be perfect. You didn't get hired at your flight school, but you put out resumes and you got your 1,000 hours at a different flight school and you drove across country to do it. You got to take those sacrifices early, but ultimately it ends up in being kind of a really fun career. So I'm glad that you kind of mentioned that because it's important, life decisions. And it's also interesting to hear that your passion for helicopters kind of came later in life. A lot of our guests, including myself, kind of knew from a very early age kind of what we wanted to do. So it's fun to always hear kind of a path that wasn't as straightforward. So anyway, I'm sorry I cut you off, but I just want to make those 2 points. So you got your time, and I'm sorry. What did you start doing after flight instruction? Liberty.
Yeah, so after flight instruction, I went to Liberty, got my turbine transition. They're an awesome company. I did tours with them for a few years, and then they started a sister company called Fly Nyan, who does a lot of film production, doors off, photo flights, stuff like that. So I worked for Fly Nyan as well for a few years. Transitioned into the Twin Star, did some corporate charter type stuff in the Twin Star. And after about a total of 7 years, I mean, I love New York City, don't get me wrong, but the lifestyle there is hard. It is chaotic. It is like, yeah, it'll put some years on you. So after about 7 years, I said, what's my next move? I could stay in New York, go into either, there's a few options in New York City. It's like EMS, or you could go into like a Sikorsky and do corporate charters. There's not a lot outside of that in New York City. So I started looking around. I honestly just found Columbia doing a job search online. And I was like, oh, this looks cool. It says overseas, like Afghanistan. That sounds pretty fun. I don't know what that means, but I sent my resume in, and luckily my company was going to Heli Expo that year, and I was going there to support them at Heli Expo. They had a booth and they were doing some flights there. So I went over there to Heli Expo. I saw that Columbia was at the career fair. So it kind of snuck away on one of my breaks. And I took my resume and I was like, here, like I turned in my resume online, but I just wanted to meet you guys in person. And yeah, that's how it started essentially. So got the job with Columbia, and about a month later I went to training in Aurora. And then a couple months later I got my secret clearance and they sent me over to Afghanistan.
That's crazy. I mean, it's so cool. And to our listeners out there, if you haven't been to Expo, I highly recommend it. It's tremendous. Not just to go and like see the awesomeness of our industry. And it's like that one place where all the helicopter dorks and nerds combine for, one time a year. So it's like great to connect with people that are like-minded, but also perfect for networking. And so it's neat to hear that you kind of took advantage of that opportunity. They were there this year at Heli Expo. They had one of the Chinooks there. Actually, we were filming content for the podcast on Arrivals Day, and watching them try to get the Columbia Chinook from the landing area to the expo, man, it took some serious logistics. They had to adjust the rotors. They had to because you had to go under a bridge, like under this overpass, and for the Chinook, I mean, it really took some finagling. I have like a time lapse of the whole thing. It's super cool, and it was kind of fun to see that. So, what year was that then when you approached Columbia?
Let's see. I think that was in 2018. Yeah, that was spring of 2018.
Okay, so you've been there for some time now. It's
Hmm.
interesting for me to hear because I always kind of define flying as like two avenues, like white collar flying and kind of more blue collar flying. Say corporate EMS, news, tours, kind of more in that white collar, and utility, kind of more in this blue collar. Is kind of how I've always at least kind of broken it down in simple terms. And I don't think it's always super common, I guess, for people to make too many switches. It's kind of a path that you either follow and you stay on that path. So it's interesting to hear that you were kind of doing more of the tours and charter and things like that than to have kind of this idea to go and do more utility environment, let alone going over to Afghanistan or something like that. So, I mean, was it just like an opportunity, and so you just took advantage of the opportunity, or is it something that you were really at that time drawn to?
Well, I didn't know a lot about utility flying. I obviously didn't have any experience in that industry, but it looked fun. It looked really fun, and I've seen some videos of like helicopters doing the power line work and firefighting, and I thought it just looked really fun. So when I did see the opportunity, Afghanistan was cool because it was 135 obviously, but we transported passengers and cargo internally, and then we also had the long line work that we did. So you just got the best of both worlds there, and it was also a fantastic training ground for the 107 and the 234.
Yeah, it's awesome. I can't wait to kind of talk more about that and your training experience. But first, a quick word from our sponsors.
Bell is proud to sponsor Vertical Helicasts and their vision to hold meaningful mission, safety, and best practice conversations in the helicopter industry. The lessons learned from these conversations will undoubtedly shape the future of both new and veteran helicopter operators.
All right, so I am curious to I mean, I've had a lot of friends that have gone to Columbia, Dan, of course, being one of them, but I've had a lot. My good buddy Josh Gianni, I don't know if you ever crossed paths with him. He was on the podcast recently. He's in Maryland now, flying for the state police. And I've just had a handful of others. So it's kind of my understanding that kind of the traditional path at Columbia is starting SIC and then, hopefully at some point transitioning your way to becoming a command pilot. What was that process like for you? What were some of the things that were maybe not expected, some of the challenges that you faced? And kind of how did you get to, flying SIC to now being a command pilot?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The typical, I guess, path is SIC to PAC, unless there's some specific cases that people go in with a type rating already, say from another company. But yeah, if you don't have any experience in the heavies, specifically the 107 or the 234 Chinook, then you'll go in as a SIC. I'll just speak to my experience in Afghanistan because, with that contract being gone now, it might be a little bit different looking. But essentially, you go in, you have to go to training first for SIC, and then they ship you right off. So it's sort of just like trial by fire. They'll put you in with the PIC. And mostly what you're doing is running the EFBs, you're monitoring instruments, you're monitoring the engines, you're looking for traffic, you're doing all that sort of paperwork type of stuff. But some of the PICs would let me fly certain legs if we had like a light load or something like that. Nothing external, of course, if you're SIC, because you literally can't see from the right seat down there.
Sure.
Maybe
Yeah.
if you're like 7 feet tall. And, I do want to touch on moving from a single pilot aircraft to a crewed environment. I felt that was one of the more difficult things because number one, you have this other person that, everybody's different. Everybody wants different call outs. They want you to talk more, talk less, this and that. And so the interpersonal, like the crew management in theirs is just wildly different than the single pilot where you're just like, I'm making all the decisions. If I have an emergency, I'm the one dealing with it. All the responsibilities are kind of spread. So that was definitely a transition for me. Of course, at first I was like, what am I supposed to do with my hands? But once you get used to that, it's
That's like
pretty
I just got
cool.
to say, like, that's one of my favorite all time quotes, like Will Ferrell. I don't know where to put my hands.
Yeah.
It's, I'm glad that you bring up that point though, because that is a really interesting aspect, right? Of going from single pilot to now two pilots, two egos, two different schools, two different ways to do something. I mean, that could be amazing and it can be really hard. I think our military friends have the opposite, right? They're always flying two crew and then they have to go into maybe a single pilot environment if they're coming EMS or whatnot. So it is interesting. And I'm glad that you brought that up. What were some of the ways that you kind of navigated that and kind of ultimately out how to work in that dual pilot environment?
The real big thing is just communication. You just had it. You want to communicate with the other pilot before the mission actually starts. Like, what are you looking for? What call outs do you want? What pisses you off, sort of thing like that.
That's
And
a good
you
question.
learn pretty quickly, like how to interact with the other pilot. We also had a cabin crew member in the back, and sometimes we had a flying mechanic. So more often than not, we had 4 crew on board. So if we're flying somewhere, the weather was marginal or something like that, all it would take is for even the cabin crew member in the back to say, I'm uncomfortable with this, and then the mission was over, which I thought everybody did a really good job about in Afghanistan, and Colombia is a great proponent of that, and they'll never they'll never ding you for making a decision like that, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I mean, that's tremendous. I mean, I think the industry by and large is moving in that direction. There's still some outliers that aren't necessarily supporting good pilot decision making. But I would say by and large, big companies like Columbia and a lot of air medical companies and other operators are allowing pilots and crew members, whether it's a SIC pilot or a flight engineer in the back or a medic, they're allowing them to make decisions, which I think is and supporting decisions, right? We dealt with that. My last flying gig was air medical, and we had we call it the 51% rule, where everyone has 51% power. And the way that I approached it was like, if I'm in a flight and I get 51%, I feel like I already kind of failed because I wasn't communicating beforehand. So I was in one situation where there was a 51% on a weather call. And instead of having my medic call the 51%, I just declined it. We could have gone, it was fine, but he shared his concerns with me. I listened to it and I said, look, if you're not comfortable, we won't go. I'll just decline the flight and we won't go through the hassle of doing, say, a 51%. So I think it's important to always be communicating with your flight crew. As a command pilot, especially, I'm sure that you guys have some bit of a rotation of, SIC pilots that will come and fly with you. Do you kind of coach these individuals a little bit, kind of spur that conversation of like, hey, here's what I'm looking for. Here's what I need from you. Is that kind of the burden of you as the PIC, or how does that kind of dynamic work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I can only speak for myself and how I operate, but I like to set expectations, before we go flying, of course. And anytime, one thing I do tell the SIC or anybody in the aircraft, I say, if you see something that you don't like that I'm doing, I don't care how much experience they have. I don't care if they're right out of flight school, but if they see something they don't like, just tell me. I don't like having a, ego driven environment in the helicopter because it always will get you into trouble. So that's one thing I do tell them. And for me, so far, it's worked out pretty well. We have a bunch of great SICs at Columbia. So
Yeah, I mean, I think like you said, communication is key. Both sides, kind of a two-way street, and kind of supporting each other, not working against each other. I've always found it fascinating because I've only flown little helicopters. The largest airframes I've flown was maybe a 130 or a 407. Bigger than a Robbie, but considerably smaller than a Chinook or a 107. What is it like, that first experience getting into a tandem rotor helicopter like that after only having small helicopter experience?
yeah, so I went from the A Star and Twin Star, very similar though, to the 107. And the first time I got in there, I was just like, it was a little overwhelming, obviously, but it's like a big old boat. It's not like the A Star where it's like super zippy. It's like a little race. It could be like a race car, but it's not. It depends. It feels like a race car now because I'm used to flying it. But compared to the A Star, some of the smaller airframes, everything happens a lot more slowly in there. You make an input, you kind of see what that helicopter does. I mean, you know how it's going to respond, but you want to wait for the response of the helicopter. You obviously need the SIC who's ever in the right seat or the left seat to clear the helicopter. You have zero visibility over there. So you're really relying on that other person to make sure you're safe. If we're landing in some sort of confined environment that we're, far away enough from like treetops, stuff like that. So it's definitely a bit of a transition. We also have different procedures for, say, settling with power. You don't push the cyclic forward like you would in a single rotor helicopter because it'll just make it worse. You use lateral cyclic and just, stuff like that. For example, if you do a sort of a steep approach and you flare a little too hard, that aft rotor is going to actually pull the tail down. So you could fall out, with the tail. So it's just a few different types of techniques. But once you get used to it, I don't think I'm going to ever go back to a tail rotor.
That's funny. I mean, it's from an outside perspective, it seems like it would be amazing. It's just a giant helicopter. I don't know. From my perspective, I can hardly fathom just the idea of just how large, every time I'm next to, say, a 107 or a Chinook, like at Heli Expo, where I was kind of up close and seeing them land and taxi, I was like, Jesus, they're giant. Like, they're just, even in person, it's just such a bigger machine. So the idea of being up front and controlling that machine would just be super cool. Transitioning from, SIC to then moving kind of more into a PIC role. I know you can only speak to your experience, and I'm sure it's different for everyone, even at Columbia. But how did that whole process kind of work for you? And what would be some advice maybe to someone at Columbia or maybe even another utility operator that's in a dual pilot role that wants to eventually try to work their way into a PIC position?
Yeah. So the whole process, and this was in Afghanistan. We had a fantastic training program in Afghanistan because we did a lot of cargo, internal cargo, and we flew a lot of passengers. And we kind of have the same situation going on in Africa right now too. All of our cargo for the World Food Program is an internal cargo, so they don't want us to do long line. So the process, I mean, the way it happened for me is that they let me fly from the right seat. Some of the PICs would let me fly right seat, so you get used to that. And then Columbia, the chief pilot would let you know, hey, we're gonna start upgrading you. They put you in the left seat with a flight instructor in the right seat, and you just get really used to the aircraft. And we had a lot of opportunities to do all sorts of stuff, engine out procedures. We have a stability augmentation system in the 107, so we would turn that off. It was great. And then after a few hundred hours, they'd send you for your check ride. And I don't know, the process is pretty straightforward. What I would say to somebody who wants to become a PIC, is, especially at Columbia right now, we'd actually just upgraded, I think, 6 SICs to 107 PIC, or they're in the process. And we're upgrading to 107 PICs to the 234, one of them being Dan Dopker. We're talking about Dan a lot today.
Danimal.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess what I would say is, just do your job well, do your SIC job well. Don't complain. I know it sounds like really simple, but like the people who just did their job, kept their head down, and were just like willing to help out and be engaging and wanting to learn, like ask questions about the aircraft, ask questions about the systems, study the systems on your own, and just have like this, working knowledge of what you're doing, and show that you want, you're interested in that position. That's all you can do. And I think it's worked out well for most of the SACs.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny because it is kind of a rudimentary thought. Just be a good person, right? Work hard, volunteer for things. It's not always intuitive for everyone, though. And I've seen that a lot in the industry. I've seen people that, in my opinion, maybe kind of shoot themselves in the foot. Really good pilots, but maybe hard to work with. And so I've always, I'm doing kind of a solo podcast discussion, every few episodes. It's just me, and I talk about kind of my path and getting hired and my experience as a hiring manager and different things like that. And then talking with guests like yourself, kind of the overwhelming response and feedback is always a bit the same. It's like, hey, when you're at an organization, they kind of expect that you can fly the machine and you can most likely handle the responsibilities, say in this case, as a PIC. So it's more about attitude. It's like, hey, do we want to continue to work with this person? Do we like working with this person? And, do they bring 100% every day? And it can be hard. I'm sure what I know of Columbia, especially during the Afghanistan time, like that, you guys are working hard. It's 28 days of like all day flying. You're in the Middle East. I'm sure there's times where it could be easy to maybe be a little bit of a negative Nancy, right? Where you're maybe just having a bad day or whatever it might be. It could be easy to complain, but I'm sure you have to kind of internalize some of that sometimes, just to always try to bring your A game. So, I think it's all about attitude, and I'm glad to hear that within Columbia, it's kind of seems like it's the similar deal. So how long ago was that when you were kind of transitioning from SIC to PIC?
That was about, I think, just under 4 years ago. I'm pretty sure, yeah, about a year into flying SIC is when they started transitioning me to PIC.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that seems to be somewhat of a common time frame that I've heard. I think it also is heavily predicated on, what kind of contracts are in the works at that time. So I know that that can change, but it sounds and seems pretty standard. So you were doing the Afghanistan deal. How long were you involved in that contract?
So I was involved in Afghanistan, I mean, until it ended, I think 3 years. And then it ended somewhere like COVID got wrapped up in it, the contract ended. So yeah, about 3 years in Afghanistan. And then I did firefighting stateside for a summer, and then did a bunch of training for our Philippines contract, which I didn't end up going to, but we have that's a active contract. And then I went to Africa. Let's
It's
see,
crazy.
last year. Yeah.
So, I mean, pretty amazing to be able to travel kind of all around the world. What is it like? What is your schedule in Africa? I know that you said you just got back from Turkey as well. What is kind of your common schedule? What are the accommodations like for you when you're in country? What is kind of the day in the life look like when you're abroad like that?
Yeah, so it just really depends on the contract, like you said. Turkey and Africa are like completely different contracts. So Turkey styles, obviously they're in different locations, but like style. So Turkey is firefighting. So for Turkey, we're 28 days on, 28 days off. Same with Africa. All the overseas contracts are a 28-28 schedule. So you get there, you switch out with your offsider. We'll do a little like pass down. And in Turkey, our contract is from sunrise to sunset, and we just stand by for a fire call. So you could be flying like all day, or you could be flying not for a few days, it depends on the fire activity. In Africa, we are same 28-28, and we start around, gosh, I forget. I think it's around 6:30. So we'll go in, pre-flight the aircraft. We have like a specific um, like concept of operation. It's like a mission plan for the day. So they'll say, okay, you have X amount of food. They load the food on the aircraft the night before, and we'll fly that food out to like a remote village, usually near the border of Mali or Niger. That's where like the really affected areas are. They've been cut off from food supplies by essentially terrorists. So we fly the food out there, and we'll go back and forth to like a fuel location and a food location all day for them. And we usually get off around 5 p.m. in Africa. So it's actually a pretty nice like work-life balance there. And oh, your other question. So the accommodations in both Africa and Turkey are hotels. They're usually like fairly nice. The one in Africa is really nice. It's in the capital city of Ouagadougou. So it's about 5 minutes from the airfield, and they put all the mechanics, all the pilots, everybody goes in there. So at the end of the day, it's real nice. You can like go have a beer with your, friend. And yeah, it's been pretty nice there actually.
That's super cool. I can't wait to talk more about that with Christine after this quick sponsor call.
This podcast is brought to you by Celicopter. Tired of listings that go nowhere? Exhausted by tire kickers who waste your time? Don't sell your helicopter alone. Celicopter handles the entire process from start to finish. So, if your helicopter has sat too long waiting for a buyer, contact the team at Celicopter today for your complimentary market valuation. Call 1-855-CELICOPTER, 1-855-735-5226, or email sales@celicopter.com. Celicopter. List it, sell it, done.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that your, accommodations are nice over there. It just seems like such a wild thing, and it's probably a really neat experience as well to be able and experience other cultures, flying, food supplies to remote villages. I'm sure it kind of gives you a different perspective of kind of our Western lifestyle, compared to how a lot of other people live. So I'm sure that that's been kind of an impactful experience. what's your go-to like travel hack? Like I have some international travel coming up here, and I'm trying to like mitigate my when I get home jet lag. Do you have any tips or anything, or are you just am I just screwed?
No, no, I don't think you're screwed. So I do have an app I use actually that I really like.
Okay.
It's called Time Shifter. And you put in your flights and like you put it in maybe a day before. Sometimes I forget and do it right when I'm getting on the airplane, but it'll give you like windows. Like right now you should be drinking caffeine, like 1 cup of coffee per hour. I don't, that's a lot of caffeine, but okay. And then sometimes it'll tell you like, okay, you should be asleep right now. And if you do take melatonin, like take the melatonin. So that's actually been working pretty well for me. It's a little hard to stick to because like they'll want you to sleep, when you don't feel like sleeping, right? So they'll be like, get on the airplane and go to sleep. But I'm like sitting there like, okay, I should be sleeping, but I'm wide awake, right? Um, but that's what I found really helps to mitigate jet lag. So
Yeah, I like
it's
that.
been working well.
I'll have to try that out. My wife and I went to Southeast Asia last year, and getting there was like fine. I think because we were excited and we were waking up at weird times, but we just like get up at 4. Okay, we're up at 4. Let's go explore. And it was like whatever. Coming home and then getting back into like the reality of work and life. It's like that's when I really felt the just tremendous jet lag. Do you have like a time? Like when you get to Africa, say, do you have like a day to kind of acclimate, or I mean, are you just kind of getting right into work?
No, we normally just to make it fair for the offsider, we normally just butt right up against to the offsider. So like in Turkey, I'll get there. Sometimes I don't get there till like midnight, which is a little tiring. But once we get there, then the offsider can leave pretty much that night. So we'll get there, get as much sleep as we can, and then just start
Just get right into it.
start blasting. Yeah, but it's easier for me to go to work. It's harder for me to come home. I don't know why. I don't know if it's
Really?
like yeah, even though I'm like off at home, I'll be waking up at like 3 a.m. at home just like wandering around my house. But I think going to work, like you said, there's like stuff to do, right? So I got to get up and go to work. So it's usually like a couple of days and I feel fine.
Certainly. So I think obviously every job has the greats and some of the not so greats. I've certainly experienced things that I really love about certain jobs that I've had and things that, they weren't my favorite. Aeromedical, I've talked about. I'm not a night guy. I was not good at waking up at 3 in the morning, and ultimately led to a kind of a short career of only 2 years, flying aeromedical because I just wasn't for me because of that aspect. One thing that I think about when I think of someone like yourself is the schedule. 28 on, 28 off sounds pretty awesome for a lot of reasons, but it also sounds a little bit difficult for other just personal life considerations. What is some of the advice or what are some of the things that you do to kind of support a healthy work life balance when you're not working and you're, on your 28 days off?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It is kind of a unique schedule. It's a little hard to balance sometimes. Um, so to speak like specifically to your question, I come home and I have a dog. We have a dog. My husband's also a pilot at Columbia Helicopters. So,
Oh, cool.
and we're luckily they're awesome because they put us on the same schedule,
I was
which
going
is
to say
great.
are you not opposite, are you?
No, no, they've been so awesome about that. I do have to like give them a shout out. So they put us on the same schedule. He was stateside this last rotation. I was in Turkey. So, but sometimes we'll be like in the same place. Sometimes we'll even be on the same aircraft. So sometimes we'll be like seeing each other every day. But when I get home, we pick up the dog. She's like, "Who are you?" She lives with she
You guys
lives
look
with
familiar. Can't put my finger on
yeah.
it, but I think I
Yeah,
know you.
a poor dog. But no, she's great. She stays with another retired pilot friend that we have, and they take great care of her. They're retired, so we pick her up. And then my husband and I usually plan like we'll like go on trips, we'll go camping, and that's just how we keep the balance. We hang out with a lot of people who are also pilots and also have that sort of shift. work
Sure.
schedule. Because, on Tuesday, all your 9 to 5 friends, Tuesday at 10 a.m., you're not hanging out with them, right?
Can't be
So,
drinking beer at 10 a.m. if you're a normal person at 10.
no, no, exactly. But yeah, that's just how we balance it. We just try to plan some fun stuff and go see family and stuff when we're off work. I visit a lot of friends going in and out of work. So I visited a friend in Amsterdam 2 rotations ago, and I visited a girlfriend who lives in Madrid this time. So I'll
Oh,
sort of
very
like
cool.
piggyback it onto the travel in and out. So that's kind of a cool perk to have that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's awesome that your husband also flies and you're on the same rotation, because essentially then you
Yeah.
get all the time off together as well, which I think it would be, I think it's probably it could be hard on marriages if one person isn't a pilot, and they're kind of working the 9 to 5 normal job, and then you're kind of in and out every other month. So that's really neat that you guys share that. And it's also kind of cool. I've always wondered, because my wife, she's part of my helicopter business, but she's not really a helicopter person per se. She's guilty by association, right? But not like, she can't really talk too in depth on helicopters. So, I always thought it would be kind of fascinating to have my partner be someone like that understands like the nuances. So that's really cool that you guys have that connection. Obviously, you all met. Do you all meet at Columbia?
We did, yes. we
Very
we met
cool.
in Afghanistan. Yeah, so we both worked in Afghanistan together. And his dad is also like a old time, a very high time pilot here. One of the best pilots that I've ever seen, honestly. So his dad works at Columbia. His sister works at Columbia. So
Man,
it's
it's
a
like a
whole
family. It's a
family.
family affair.
Yeah, it's a whole
You guys will be
family.
running the place soon enough. On the podcast today, I'm talking to the future owner of Columbia. No, I'm kidding.
No thanks.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I could, I think the work-life balance for that type of schedule can be really challenging, but it sounds like you guys are in a really good position, which probably makes it kind of easier. One of the things that I'm always kind of fascinated in aviation is the lack of females in aviation, let alone helicopter aviation. I think it's like less than 1% are total for aviation, and that encompasses fixed wing. So I'm sure that the numbers for the rotorcraft side are a lot smaller. What would you how would you encourage young women to get involved in aviation? What has it been like for you, being female and kind of navigating a very male dominated industry, which I personally think is one of the reasons why more women don't get involved, is because it seems like a bit of a tall order. I don't want to talk too poorly about my kind, but male helicopter pilots, big egos, boisterous, could be difficult to be around. I could see that being a hurdle and something that's kind of a turnoff for a female to get involved. So, what has that experience been like for you, and how can we help try to encourage more women to get involved in helicopter aviation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I do get asked this a lot. I don't like getting singled out for it. I'm going to say that, but it's totally fine you asked it. But I just want to be seen as like a human flying a helicopter, right? But
Sure.
I think it's an important question. I started out in engineering, which is also a very male oriented profession. I worked
True.
in the oil fields. So I kind of had that like thing already kind of going on. And overall, my experience in aviation has been overwhelmingly positive. Overwhelmingly. There's only been like a few people here and there that have like made little comments or, but I just ignore that. I think to get like young women into aviation in general, I just didn't even know it was an option. As a kid, I grew up, it wasn't really like, it just wasn't an option to me. I wasn't ever told about it. I didn't like, I think maybe, just outreach programs and just knowing that it's even there, that we can even do it. I think that's important, and hopefully your podcast will help with that. Yeah, but I've had a great experience overall, and Columbia treats me just like any other pilot. They're like, can you do the mission? Can you do it safely? And that's the only thing that really matters. So I've had the same opportunities as everybody else here, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And I've seen, again, I don't have the female perspective, but by and large, anytime that I've worked with in an organization where there's also female pilots or other female coworkers, I mean, again, it's just another strong person on the team, and I haven't necessarily seen too much. I've definitely, some of the old timers might make some comments sometimes or something that's maybe a little unsettling, but I think we are kind of transitioning into comments of that are kind of dying with that era, hopefully. And I think social media is a big play. I think hopefully young women are perusing around social media and not getting too stuck on the gender normal of what videos they should be watching, and coming across your content and seeing kind of the cool things that you're doing as a helicopter pilot. And I'm guessing that because of social media, we will actually start seeing more individuals, men and women, entering helicopters. Because, like you said, whether you're a guy or a girl, there's it's really kind of a weird industry to even think that you could get involved in. A lot of what we've talked about on the podcast is this idea of being a first generation pilot, meaning that no one in your family really has piloting experience. That was kind of my experience and my background. So how do you even navigate into getting into this world, in this industry? And I think social media, now that people are starting to see like, oh yeah, Christine's doing this and Halsey's doing that and so is doing this. It's like, it actually shows that, hey, this is something that you can do on the civilian route. Whereas a lot of people probably think, hey, maybe it's only a military thing. Where I would say, by and large, our rotor wing industry is comprised of civilian trained pilots. A lot of military, but very heavily weighted on the civilian side. So I think hopefully social media will have kind of a positive impact on that. So thank you for talking about that, and again, I hope that if you're listening and you want to get in aviation, boy or girl, it's possible. There's avenues and there's ways to do it, and so I think that's important, and hopefully this platform can help individuals like that. One of the things that we kind of talked about in our little email correspondence back and forth was you you mentioned something very near and dear to my heart, which was go around. And I don't know what your story is. I'm fascinated to hear about it, but I've always been a proponent of go arounds. When I was a flight instructor, I was religious about being like, hey, look, really good pilots do go arounds. If something's not lining up right, doesn't look good, do a go around. I had an experience at Maverick Helicopters where I was new, and we halfway through the tour on the way back, we had to land in this fuel farm, and we're all bombing down to get to this fuel farm, and it's close. Everyone's kind of tailgating essentially, and you're new to flying the 130. It's kind of a heavy aircraft. It really carries its speed. You have to be cautious about your power at the bottom, especially if it's really hot out. And so there was a situation where I'm getting tailgated pretty hard. I don't like my profile coming in on short approach. I do a go around. And one of the other pilots made a negative comment about it on the company frequency. And I talked to that individual after. But the ironic part was the management actually pulled me aside and gave me like the attaboy. Like, hey, great decision. If it doesn't look good, why force it? I would much rather do a go around than crash a helicopter or bend metal or hurt someone. So I'm curious to hear kind of your experience and what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great tool, and I think that people don't use it enough. I mean, there's no like shame in doing a go around. I've done so many go around. I mean, I can just think of two off the top of my head that I just did a month ago or a couple weeks ago, I guess. The first one, we were firefighting, and I pull a big bucket of water out. We can pull, at around 20,000 pounds of water. So it's a big bucket of water, right? And I'm going up, and we have a Turkish interpreter pilot. Right. My clock's going off.
Cuckoo clock. I like it. Does it go
Um,
off like in the middle of the night too? It's like every hour?
no, it shuts off at like 10 p.m.
Okay, that's good at
It's a
least.
huge clock. Okay. Sorry. Anyway, so yeah, I was firefighting in Turkey. We got a big bucket of water, and we have a Turkish interpreter pilot on board. Now they sit in the jump seat, and essentially their role is to speak Turkish to the helitac or whoever's overseeing the fire, um, or anybody on the ground. So he's speaking Turkish. He's like, "Go drop it right there." So we pull up this, the side of this mountain, and I'm looking down, and I'm about to drop the water, and there's just like hundreds of firefighters down there. And then it's not like the US, it's a little more organized. But they're just sort of scattered in the trees. They're like, one's like on a rock. I mean, they're just like, he's like, drop it right there. And they're just so close to the fire. So I'm like, no, we're not dropping it. So I went around and had them, move everybody out of the way. So that's a big deal, because you can kill somebody with 20,000 pounds of
Yeah,
water.
20 pounds of, yeah,
Yeah,
seriously. And that's an
yeah,
interesting concept too, because in that instance, you're making a go around decision, not based on necessarily the safety of the aircraft, but the safety of the personnel on the ground. So I think that
right.
that's just another PIC decision that you have to make in that moment, which, again, hopefully could have, I don't know what, yeah, I guess if you drop 20,000 gallons of, or 20,000 pounds of water on someone, that's probably not a good, not a good day for them.
No, exactly. And, there's just so many experiences I've had like that. And also in Turkey about a month ago, I got pretty developed, or I was getting developed into settling with power. I was deep in a canyon. They wanted me to drop at the bottom of a canyon. It was like a box canyon. We were just next to the wall of the canyon, and I just couldn't get the aircraft down. My descent rate was like super high, and I was pulling back to bleed off my airspeed. And I started feeling like, this isn't right, So instead of just forcing it to the fire, I just dropped to the water and I said, we're flying away. So that's the good thing about firefighting. Most of the time, the bucket will open, and you can dump that water and get
Sure.
out of the situation. But that's just, I, yeah, I think it's important to recognize those situations before it gets so developed that your go around is no longer an option. I think people get too developed, and then they go, oh, I think I should. And by that time, it's too late sometimes.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. There's so many, it's maybe even cliche to talk about a little bit, but it's always like when you look at accidents and accident reports, it truly is kind of like what they say, that Swiss cheese, kind of, one decision that leads into another decision to another decision, and then it ends into some type of negative result. So, I think it's super important to understand and know the limitations of the aircraft, know your personal limitations. And if you start to kind of go down that path of feeling like, this doesn't seem right, then it's probably not right, right? Kind of trusting your gut, which I know is something else that you've kind of talked about. So what are some examples in your career so far where you've kind of gone with your gut and made a decision based on that?
Yeah, that's a great segue into that, trusting your gut. And your gut's not always right, but it does I feel like it does kind of warn you, um, that it knows, right? It knows that something's wrong. So I was flying in, let's see, I was flying in New York City, and I used to fly this, a quite famous, like, she's like a talk show host, but I used to fly her, and she had like 3 kids. I used to fly them out from Long Island to the city for her to do her show. So one day I started flying out there. The weather's bad. They get fogged in all the time over there. So I get to her, house or wherever I'm picking her up. When I turn around, and the fog has just completely closed everything in. So, I'm kind of like poking around. We're on the shore, so at least the beach is there, right? But it just like, it started giving me that weird feeling on the back of my neck. And I'm like, if I push anymore, I think that, I'm just going to get in a really bad situation. So I actually called up LaGuardia and asked them if I could do a precautionary landing. And we just landed. She was totally cool. She understood, and we just kind of waited till everything cleared, and I took her to the city. So
Yeah, no, it's important. I mean, again, your gut can maybe be a little over anxious sometimes and
Yeah.
maybe give, early indications. But I think if you're properly trained, you have enough experience, usually your gut's pretty in line with like, it's kind of the first indicator of like, and not just in helicopters, like anything in life, like, trusting your gut in a business decision or a personal relationship decision, whatever it may be, your gut always seems to somewhat kind of have this 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 forward looking insight that it doesn't seem like the brain always gets, right? Or I guess it is the brain, but you know what I mean. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to
Yeah.
kind of do that. And as helicopter pilots, I think we're, I know that when I was flying full time, I was always kind of relying on, hey, this gut feeling. And yeah, you get the weird ones sometimes, like, oh, I had a weird dream last night. I don't really feel like flying today. Like that's maybe not the right gut feeling that we're talking about, but it's, in the moment, in a situation, I think it's your gut that kind of is that first indication that you should at least be thinking of something, kind of that little punch of, hey, focus on the situation here. So yeah, really glad that we got to talk about that, and glad that we got to kind of hear about your career. I think it's super fascinating, uh, giving up probably a pretty good career in engineering to do this crazy helicopter thing. Seems like it's working out. I hear your dogs. They sound
Yes.
unhappy.
She probably just saw like a turkey or something. Yeah.
Yeah. My dog is Halloween. People like complain about 4th of July with their dogs. Luckily, my dog does not care about fireworks. My dog is not a Halloween fan, though. The constant doorbell ringing and door knocking. We used to live out in the country in Texas and never had trick or treaters. This year, we're in a neighborhood with lots of kids. We had constant traffic last night. My poor dog was just going nuts. So
Oh,
I don't
no.
think it's a proponent. But Christine, thank you so much for coming on. Uh, your Instagram handle, is it just Charlie at Charlie? I don't even know how Instagram works sometimes.
It's Fly Charlie Fly. So FlyCharlie
Okay, we will make
Yeah.
sure that we put that in the bio. Again, we stumbled across your profile because of the cool content that you're putting out there. And so if you haven't followed Christine, we highly suggest that you do, because she's putting out some cool stuff and kind of live vicariously through what she's doing in her career as a command pilot. To our listeners, always a big thanks. You guys make this show possible and give me the motivation and the drive to continue to do it. And I'm very fortunate to have great guests like Christine. And again, thank you to our sponsors, both at Vertical Helicasts. If you haven't checked out the other podcasts on Vertical Helicasts, the Hangar Z podcast with John Gray and the Real Rescue with Jason Quinn, aka Quinny, you should definitely check them out. They're producing some really fun content. John is kind of more centered around law enforcement, whereas Quinny was a rescue swimmer, number 500 with the U.S. Coast Guard. And so he's talking to individuals that kind of had that same career path. So really cool platform. Special thanks to Bell Helicopter and, of course, my favorite business, Celicopter, for supporting the Helicopter podcast. Christine, thank you again for joining. And we look forward to connecting again and continue to fly safe. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Halsey. It was a pleasure.